COSATU, is calling on Parliament to speed up amendments to South Africa's Employment Equity Act. The new provisions will empower Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi to set transformation targets and sanction non-compliance. It will also empower labour inspectors to request and obtain written undertakings from their employers on their plans for employment equity. Now, this bill comes amid dissatisfaction at the slow rate of transformation since the Employment Equity Bill was introduced some 21 years ago, and the Congress believes the bill will strengthen government's ability to hold employers accountable. For more on this story, we're joined now by COSATU's Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks, via our video link. Matthew, a very good morning to you once again on this Wednesday morning. It's 21 years in the making, and I'm just taking a look at some of the amendments here. They are quite wide-ranging, but I suppose the question is, why has it taken so long for such amendments to now be part of the Act?
Look, we share those frustrations. That's something we've been raising with government, with the minister, with the department, etc., and with Parliament. This bill left NEDLAC in 2019, took 2 years to get it through to the committees. Unfortunately, this is a frequent occurrence across departments at Parliament and so on. It takes on average about 5 years to pass a bill. It's something that Parliament and government need to address because often, as you say, interventions are badly needed or long overdue. But nonetheless, it's in Parliament, it's in the Portfolio Committee now, and we've received their assurance that they would pass it this year so that it could come into effect by next year.
So for you, what are some of the more important amendments to this bill? And I suppose top of the list will be, setting targets for employers and also making sure that they can account for those targets.
Look, first, there's quite a few progressive interventions. One is that employers have to be in compliance with paying the workers at least above the minimum wage. So no one can paying them less. So when employers submit their annual reports, that must be included. It updates the definition of disabilities to include intellectual or sensory disabilities. But I think some of the more critical ones also is that employers have to consult workers and the trade unions about the employment equity reports. It empowers critically the minister to have a more nuanced and surgical approach to particular sectors of the economy or particular occupation levels or particular regions or sub-regions which are particularly far behind employment equity targets. And that's a useful approach because often some industries or sectors or regions are in compliance. Others are far behind, so you need to have a more nuanced approach. It helps us because it allows for a variation because, our demographic diversity is quite diversified according to which province, which region you live in.
So, Matthew, take us through some of the employment equity targets and perhaps, which industries are are lagging behind the most. If we look at corporate South Africa, for example, is it fair to say that in the main they are lagging behind?
Sure. So look, basically the minister would have to set targets for each sector and so forth. He would have to consult with the Employment Equity Commission. So they must determine what are the particular targets based upon what stats SA would say, how far they're behind. But I think you're right. If you look at the public service, it by and large reflects the demographic diversity of the country across band levels. But if you look at the private sector, for example, the financial sector, you'll find very few African or women managers in the banks, very few. If you look at the mining sector, equally the same. Yet you'll find that almost all the security guards are African men. Almost all the cleaners are African or colored women. So we have a huge amount of work to do. This is a useful timeous intervention because if we don't intervene, it means we accept business as usual, which we can't accept. It'll be a ticking time bomb. And look, it'll be up to each employer to show the cooperation, the goodwill. If they don't, then they won't be given the compliance certificate. They'll be given fines, etc., and be given certain times to do it. It also does empower the labour inspectors of the Department of Labour to inspect workplaces, to issue compliance orders. So that it further kind of strengthens government to nudge employers along. But also, one of the most critical aspects is that it requires government, when giving tenders to companies in future to do business with the state, that these companies receive the tenders must receive compliance certificates from the Minister of Labour. So they must be in compliance with the Employment Equity Act, with the Minimum Wage Act. They must not have been found guilty of any offences such as unfair discrimination or paying below the minimum wage within the past 3 years. So if you wanted to do business with the state, you need to be in compliance with the law. You need to be showing that you embrace good labour practices at your particular workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose those who are not in favour of this kind of legislation might argue around, particularly the last point you made just now, around receiving government tenders, that those vying for those tenders would have to give proof that they are abiding by such targets set by government, but that proof isn't false or cosmetic proof.
Sure, and look, the employers' equity reports are fairly simple. The bill also makes it a little bit easier for companies. They've also exempted the small employers as well from having to do all the paperwork. So government has shown its willingness to be flexible, but companies, if they want to do business with the state, if they want to enjoy taxpayers' money, then surely the least they can do is to be in compliance with the laws of the country. We should be moving towards a culture of having good labor practices. A worker who is paid a decent wage, is treated well, his rights are respected, etc., will be a more productive and more motivated worker. And that will benefit the company and the economy. So it's up to employers to embrace a spirit of change. We did see some critics of the bill saying this will cause job losses, and nothing could be farther from the truth. There's nothing fundamentally changing in the bill. It's more of a tweaking and an enhancing or strengthening of it. But the Employment Equity Act, as you said, has been around for 2 decades. So it's up to us to embrace change, but if we don't, the consequences will be devastating. We've seen in Zimbabwe what are the consequences if you fail to transform society. More so given South Africa's history of apartheid, of colonialism, of being the most unequal country in the world. So we have to tackle these painful truths if we want to move forward as a nation.
Absolutely. Matthew, just, I see that COSATU is excited about a whole range of aspects related to these amendments, but in particular, does the issue around strengthening collective bargaining, this provision requiring employers to consult with trade unions, does that excite you?
No, look, we're pleased with it. I think any measure which is going to strengthen collective bargaining is going to benefit everybody. Yeah. So the bill requires the employer to consult with trade unions and to report on collective bargaining and so forth. But that also, not only does it benefit workers because their voices are heard and their issues can be addressed in a positive way, it actually benefits employers too, because in the labor market, grievances can be addressed in a healthy way, timelessly, proactively, as opposed to allowing wounds to fester and become cancerous until they explode, and then there's a strike and so forth. So this actually is in the interest of everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Matthew, as always, thanks very much for your time this morning on the AM Report. COSATU's Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks, joining us there this morning. As we continue to talk about the implementation of amendments to South Africa's Employment Equity Act, COSATU calling on Parliament to speed up that process, hopefully see it in effect by next year.